In 1921, a time prior to women's equality recognition, an unlikely heroine emerged from the despondent streets of Nome, Alaska. 4 men, on their way to a one-year expedition to the Arctic, hired the desperate 23-year-old Eskimo Ada Blackjack to serve as a seamstress and cook on their treacherous adventure to Wrangel Island. The organizer of the expedition, Vihjalmur Stefansson, had sent these 4 brave men to the inhabited island for a full year so as to claim it for Great Britain, although he acted without Britain's consent. He also sought the land as a source of prosperity from its resources and to increase his fame as an explorer. Ada was reluctant to join the men on their expedition to the far north for many reasons. She had no experience with living off the land and had no wish to leave her family behind. She also held many superstitions and fear of the journey. But Ada was desperate for money. Her 5-year-old son Bennett was dying of tuberculosis and Ada had no money to hospitalize him. Her abusive ex-husband Jack Blackjack had abandoned her, forcing Ada to put Bennett in an orphanage while she struggled to find money. Ada was left with a money offer she couldn't turn down for the sake of her son, however scared she may be. So on September 9, 1921, she boarded the Silver Wave, a schooner that would take her, Alan Crawford, Lauren Knight, Fred Moorer, and Milton Gow to Wrangel Island. The men were all adamantly positive about the success of the expedition and were not subdued when the ship's engine broke down for 36 hours and they lost their small skin canoe overboard to a ferocious storm. They were not able to make any progress towards the island until the ship's engine was repaired. They finally reached their destination a week after departure and took their first steps on Wrangel Island's barren soil on September 16th. They immediately planted Great Britain's flag as instructed by Stefansson. They proceeded to spend the next 16 hours setting up their camp. They found that most of their food had spoiled or not made the journey over, and their sled dogs had already become weak. Ada was deathly afraid of polar bears and was miserable when she found that the island was crawling with them. Her homesickness and fear caused her to develop a condition called Arctic hysteria. She was constantly sobbing or emotional and developed a burning and obnoxious love for Crawford. She ran away from camp multiple times and refused to do her work. While the men were able to cook for themselves, they needed Ada to sew their winter clothes so they wouldn't freeze during the winter, which was coming quickly and snow was already on the ground. The men broke into separate camps 15 miles apart to cover more ground for hunting, which was becoming difficult, and also to keep Ada away from Crawford. Ada was not subdued. She walked the 15 miles to the other camp on multiple occasions, only to be dragged screaming back by an increasingly irritated Knight, or in one case, tied to the flagpole. The conditions on the island worsened. Hunting became impossible and the days were darker and colder, remaining around -40 degrees most of the time. The men were confined to their tents for most of the day and were miserable and regretful they had brought Ada along on the expedition. They decided she must change her behavior. Just before Christmas, they told her if she did not do her job, they would make her sleep outside in the blizzard. Ada's hysteria subsided after that, and she worked efficiently, more efficiently than even the men through the winter and spring. Spring on the island was uneventful, with weather staying cold and hunting remaining poor. By June of 1922, the group was anxious for a ship to arrive, but a blizzard hit and blocked the waterways, diminishing their hopes for rescue. In early July, Knight decided to take a small trek by himself to a part of the island called Waring Point. He took just one dog and a few supplies. His luck on this small venture mirrored that of the Wrangel Island Expedition. His heater broke down, leaving him shivering without a tent which he had forgotten to bring, and for 3 days was caught in a heavy downpour of rain. After the rain ceased, he tried to take a shortcut to get back to camp, but he ended up lost and walking twice as far. He was forced to cross the Skeleton River, which was 200 feet wide and freezing cold. Hungry, tired, wet, and cold, he finally made it back to camp. On September 10th, ice surrounded the island and all hope for a ship was totally extinguished by the impending cold weather. The group commenced planning for their second year on Wrangel Island. The first thing the men did was move their camps back together into a new location because they had exhausted their driftwood supply and wanted to try new hunting grounds. They also began preparing for a trip to Siberia in January, the coldest part of the year when the ice across the ocean would be frozen over and accessible by dog sled. They would travel from Siberia back to Nome, where they would get food and go back to rescue the remaining members, either by dog sled or ship. They also knew that there was not adequate food supply to feed all 5 of them until next summer, so 2 of them must leave. Crawford and Knight left on January 7, 1923, with the remaining pack of weakened dogs pulling an overloaded dog sled. They experienced harsh winds and rough ice that caused supplies to constantly fall off the sled, a broken stove, and temperatures at -50 degrees, and Knight became ill, and so they turned around. By now, Knight knew he had received an illness called scurvy from his swim in the Skeleton River. His body would deteriorate slowly, and he was already well into the illness. Knight was left back at camp with Ada, who was more homesick than ever, while the other 3, Gal, Crawford, and Maurer, left to make the trip. Food conditions were terrible, and there was only enough to feed the 2 of them. They were all living mostly off of seal fat. Ada was horrified at being left in the Arctic wilderness to take care of a sick man and nobody to take care of her. The men left on January 29th, just a day before a harsh storm blew in, only increasing the many hazards of their trek. Just 1 week after the other 3 had left, Knight became confined to his bed. Eventually, he grew too sick to continue writing in his own diary, so Ada started one of her own. His gums were rotting and bleeding, and his teeth were falling out. He was lethargic, choleric, and had spots covering his body. Ada worked with sincere determination to try to keep Knight alive. She learned to use a knife to hunt foxes because she was terrified of rifles. In March, she caught many foxes, which helped Knight since he couldn't eat seal blubber or hard bread any longer. She worked hard to complete the jobs that the 4 men had previously taken care of. April was a bad month for Ada. The foxes became scarce and Knight broke down and blamed Ada for his condition. He told her that her husband was a good man for beating her, and it was no wonder most of her children had died, because she was incapable of caring for him too. Ada was distraught for days by these cruel comments. She did not go back out to hunt as usual, but stayed in the tent and cried. In May, Ada taught herself to use a rifle because she knew that it would improve her hunting, which would help to cure Knight. She had continued to patiently tend to him despite his cruel attitude towards her. Her efforts were ineffectual. Ada found Knight unconscious, face shaded blue, and a half-pound tea tin filled with blood from a bloody nose. Knight's capillaries were rupturing due to his lack of nutrients, and he was constantly hemorrhaging through his nose and skin. Ada braved polar bears and her fear of rifles, and she built a platform by herself above the tent so she could shoot a polar bear from a safe distance. They were both miserable. Knight was not eating for as long as 9 days at a time, and Ada was constantly thinking about Bennett. She tried her hardest to find the best hunting techniques, but it was difficult because of the melting ice which constantly changed the island. On June 22, 1923, Knight died in his sleep. He left Ada alone on Wrangel Island until a ship came. While she left his corpse in the tent, she worked to move her supplies into the storage tent and began to prepare for the next winter in case a ship did not come. She was determined to live and thanked God every day in her diary entries that she had already come this far. 2 months after Knight's death, on August 10th, Harold Noyce led his ship to the island through a heavy fog. He liberated Ada of her isolation and misery and brought her aboard his ship to take her home after 2 years of separation from the rest of the world and, most importantly, her son. However, Ada's hardships did not end here. She asked Noyce about the other 3, and she learned that Gal, Maurer, and Crawford had not made it back but had been lost to the Arctic. She was able to live off of the money she received from the expedition for a while, but eventually Ada ran out of money. Bennett's tuberculosis had been helped, but Ada soon gave birth to another son named Billy and was now responsible for supporting him too. Stefansson and her rescuer, Harold Noyce, told disrespectful lies about her and the expedition to the media to gain popularity for themselves, and Ada wasn't able to go anywhere without being bothered by those who had read her story in the newspapers. Ada still managed to live through times even harder than her time on Wrangel Island, and she was motivated purely by love for her sons. Eventually, Ada Blackjack, the modest and discreet heroine of the Arctic and of America, died at age 85.